The moment Wesley Alden heard that Violet Holloway had driven off 3 foremen in as many months, he set his coffee cup down on the bar counter, turned to the man who had told him, and asked when he could start. The saloon in Redemption Creek, Texas, smelled like boot leather and sawdust, and the kind of whiskey that made a man's eyes water before it even touched his lips. It was the spring of 1882, and the cattle trails were busy with ambitious men who thought they knew everything there was to know about running a herd. Wesley Alden was not one of those men. He had spent 11 years working ranches from the Rio Grande to the Powder River country in Wyoming, and what those years had given him was not arrogance, but something quieter, a bone-deep understanding of land and livestock, and the kind of patience that most men his age, 29, had long since traded away for pride. The man who had told him about the Holloway Ranch was a weathered supply merchant named Gus Prentice, who delivered flour and salt and coffee beans to half the homesteads within 40 miles of Redemption Creek. Gus had a broad, sunburned face and a habit of shaking his head when he talked about things that troubled him, and the Holloway situation troubled him considerably. First foreman was a fellow named Cartwright, Gus said, refilling his own cup from the ceramic pot the barkeep left on the counter. Good man, by most accounts. Lasted 6 weeks before he rode into town with his hat in his hands and his dignity somewhere out on the south pasture. Said Miss Holloway knew more about cattle than he did and was not shy about saying so. Wesley listened without interrupting. Second one was a younger fellow, full of fire, name of Darnell. He lasted maybe 3 weeks. She fired him personally in front of the full crew, apparently because he had been selling off cattle from the east herd without logging them in the ledger. Might have been theft, might have been poor bookkeeping, but Miss Holloway did not give him the benefit of the doubt. Sounds reasonable, Wesley said. Gus pointed a finger at him. You would think. But the third one was Gerald Bauer, and Gerald Bauer has connections to every ranch within 60 miles of here, and Miss Holloway ran him off in a fashion that made enemies for the Holloway name in certain circles. What did he do? Tried to renegotiate the sale of a parcel of land that belonged to the estate of her late father without her knowledge or consent. Tried to push it through the county land office using a forged signature. She found out, rode to the land office herself, dismantled the whole arrangement in front of the clerk and 2 witnesses, and then rode back to the ranch and dismissed Bauer so thoroughly that he left the territory entirely. Wesley was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When can I start?" Gus stared at him. "You did not hear what I just said." "I heard every word. She caught a thief and ran off a fraudster. I do not see the problem." "The problem is she has a reputation now for being impossible to work for." "Or," Wesley said, picking up his coffee cup again, "the problem is that the men who tried to work for her were not good enough for the job." Gus shook his head slowly, but there was a smile at the corner of his mouth. "You are either brave or foolish, Wesley Alden." "I have been called both," Wesley said. "Now tell me how to find the Holloway Ranch." The road to the Holloway Ranch wound through cedar breaks and across 2 creek crossings, and Wesley made the journey the following morning on his bay horse, a steady animal named Drummer who had carried him through blizzards and river crossings, and had never once given him cause to doubt. The land out here was beautiful in a rough, insistent way. The hills were rocky and scrubby, the sky enormous and pale blue, and the grasses along the creek bottoms rippled in the spring wind like something alive and breathing. The ranch itself came into view after about an hour's ride. It was not what Wesley had expected, which was either a grand establishment or a broken-down wreck. Instead, it was solidly in between a main house built of limestone blocks that spoke of real permanence and intention, a long bunkhouse, a solid barn, several working pens, and a windmill that turned slowly in the morning breeze. The fences were in decent repair. The cattle he could see grazing in the near pasture were in good condition. Whoever had been running this place before the recent trouble had done something right, at least with the fundamentals. He rode to the front of the main house, and had barely dismounted before a woman came around the corner of the house from the direction of the barn, and Wesley understood immediately that this was Violet Holloway. She was 26 years old, with dark chestnut hair that she wore pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat, and she was dressed for work, heavy canvas trousers, a worn cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and boots that had seen real use. She was carrying a length of rope coiled over one shoulder and a small leather notebook in her hand, and she walked with the easy, unhurried stride of someone who had spent years moving through difficult terrain without needing to prove anything to anyone. She stopped when she saw him, assessed him with dark brown eyes that missed nothing, and said, "You are not from the county assessor's office. They send men in suits." "No, ma'am," Wesley said. "My name is Wesley Alden. I am looking for work. I heard you might have a foreman position available." Something flickered across her face, too fast to fully read, but he thought it might have been amusement. "You heard right," she said. "I also suspect you heard considerably more than that." "I heard about the 3 foremen," he said, seeing no reason to dance around it. "And you came anyway. I asked when I could start." She studied him for a long moment, and he did not fidget under that look. He had been looked over by enough ranchers in enough states to know that a man who could not hold still under scrutiny was unlikely to hold together under pressure. He stood easy, his hat in his hand, the morning sun on his face. "Come inside," she said finally. "We will talk." The main house was clean and spare, with the particular tidiness of a person who lived alone and kept order not out of habit but out of preference. There was a large oak table in the main room that served as both a dining table and a working desk, and it was covered in ledgers and correspondence and what appeared to be survey maps of the property. A stone fireplace occupied most of one wall, and above it hung a framed photograph of a man and a woman, older, dignified, clearly taken at some expense. Her parents, Wesley guessed. Violet set her rope and notebook down on a chair and went to the stove, where a coffee pot was warming. She poured 2 cups without asking if he wanted one, which told him something about how she operated, and set 1 cup in front of him as he took a seat at the table. "Tell me your work history," she said, sitting across from him and opening the leather notebook to a fresh page. He told her plainly and without embellishment. The ranch in New Mexico, where he had started as a wrangler at age 18. The 4 years he had spent in Colorado working for a cattle operation that ran 3,000 head across summer pasture and winter range. The seasons in Wyoming, where the cold was a different kind of cold entirely. The 2 years back in Texas working as a trail boss on the Kisham route before the railroads began changing everything about how cattle moved across the country. She wrote things down as he talked, asked sharp, specific questions about forage management, about handling sick cattle, about his experience with the legal side of land and livestock records. He answered every question directly. She asked him about the forged signature situation with Bauer, not by name, but obliquely, testing whether he had heard the fuller version, and he told her that any man who attempted to defraud a ranch owner of her land was not a foreman but a thief in a hat, and that she had done exactly the right thing. She looked up from her notebook. "Most men I have spoken to about that particular incident suggested I should have handled it more quietly." "Most men," Wesley said carefully, "benefit from women handling things quietly." There was a pause. Then Violet Holloway did something unexpected. She laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised, like she had not been expecting it herself. "You start Monday," she said. He started Monday. The first week, Wesley spent every daylight hour learning the ranch. He walked the fence lines personally, which surprised the 4 ranch hands, men named Otis, Pete, Caleb, and a younger fellow everyone called Rabbit on account of his large ears and fast legs. He inspected the water sources, checked the condition of the winter-thinned cattle, cataloged the equipment in the barn, and spent 2 evenings going through the ranch ledgers that Violet left out for him in the bunkhouse with a note that said simply, "Any questions, ask." He had questions. He brought them to her the following morning at the kitchen table with his cup of coffee and her own cup across from him, and the ledgers spread between them. And they talked for 2 hours about the finances of the Holloway ranch, with the directness of two people who respected numbers more than they respected small talk. The ranch had been left to Violet by her father, Emmett Holloway, who had died of a lung ailment the previous autumn. Her mother had passed when Violet was 14. She had no siblings. The ranch was entirely hers, along with a modest debt on the east pasture land, and a cattle note that came due in the fall. It was manageable but not comfortable, and the situation with the 3 foremen had cost her time and therefore money. "You have about 4 months before the note comes due," Wesley said. "I am aware," she said without defensiveness. "The east herd needs to be sorted and the culls sold by July to cover it with room to spare. That is doable. I know it is doable. I just needed someone who could help me do it." He looked at her across the table. In the morning light coming through the kitchen window, her face was very still and very serious, but he had already noticed, in just a week, that there was a great deal of feeling behind that stillness. She cared about this ranch the way people cared about the things they had fought to keep. She was not just managing an inheritance. She was defending something. "We will get it done," he said, and they did get to work. Wesley proved within the first 2 weeks that he was exactly what the Holloway ranch needed. He was not the kind of foreman who shouted orders from horseback and let the hands sort out the details. He worked beside them in the mud of the pens in the early morning cold under the blazing afternoon sun, and the hands, who had been cautious at first, warming to him in the way practical men warm to practical leadership. Slowly and then all at once. Otis, the eldest of the 4 hands, a weathered man of 50 with a white mustache and slow, deliberate movements, came to Wesley at the end of the 2nd week and said, "You are different from the others." "How so?" Wesley asked. "You listen," Otis said, as though that were both simple and extraordinary. Violet watched all of this from a careful distance. She did not hover, but she was present, riding the pastures in the morning, appearing at the pens in the afternoon, going over the ledgers each evening. She and Wesley developed a rhythm of daily meetings, brief and focused, that gradually became less brief and less focused, not because the work diminished, but because the conversation had a way of expanding beyond the immediate business of cattle and fencing and water rights. It began with small things. He mentioned once that he had grown up in a town in East Texas, and she asked which one, and when he told her, she said her mother had grown up near there, and they talked for 20 minutes about a part of the country they both knew and had both left for different reasons. He noticed around the 3rd week that she always had a book near her on the kitchen table, on the porch railing, once propped open on the fence post while she was watching a difficult calf in the pen below, and he asked her what she was reading, and she told him, and then asked if he read, and he said he did when he could get hold of something worth reading. The following morning, there was a copy of a Walter Scott novel left on the table in the bunkhouse, with a piece of paper tucked inside the front cover that said only, "Try this one." He read it in 3 evenings and brought it back to her on the 4th morning, and said it was the best thing he had read in years, and she looked genuinely pleased in the way a person looks when someone else appreciates something they love. It was the horses that truly began to bridge the remaining distance between them. Violet kept 3 horses of her own beyond the working stock, a gray mare named Clementine, an older bay gelding called Porter, and a young sorrel filly named Biscuit who had been born on the ranch the previous summer and was still in the early stages of her training. Violet worked the filly herself, early in the mornings before the full heat of the day, in the round pen beside the barn. Wesley had been watching the sessions from a distance for several days before he said anything, not wanting to intrude. But one morning the filly spooked sideways at a piece of blowing canvas and Violet nearly came off, recovering with excellent horsemanship, but landing hard enough against the fence rail to make his stomach clench from 30 yards away. He was over the fence and across the pen before he had consciously decided to move. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She was already straightening, her hat knocked sideways, one hand pressed against her ribs. "I am fine," she said, with the particular firmness of someone who is mildly not fine. "Let me see," he said. She fixed him with a look that could have peeled paint, and he met it calmly. After a moment she lifted her arm and he pressed his fingers gently along her ribs, and she winced once, and he said, "Not broken, bruised. You should stay off horseback for a day." "I have work. I have 4 capable hands and a full morning. Stay off horseback for a day, Miss Holloway." She looked at him for a long moment, and then, somewhat to his amazement, she said, "All right." He was almost back to the fence before she spoke again. "Do you know horse training, Wesley?" He turned. "Some. My father trained horses. I learned from him as a boy." She gestured at the filly, who was standing now at the far edge of the pen, watching them with large, cautious eyes. "Would you work with Biscuit while I am off her? Just ground work. I do not want her to go backwards." "Yes," he said, "I can do that." He worked with the filly for 3 days, not because Violet stayed off horseback for 3 days, but because after the first session, she came and sat on the fence rail to watch, and then came again the next morning, and they fell into a conversation about the horse that stretched well beyond the groundwork, covering Violet's training philosophy and Wesley's father's methods, and the particular intelligence of sorrel horses in general. And by the 3rd morning they were standing side by side at the fence watching Biscuit move, and their conversation had nothing to do with horses at all anymore. It was about her father. She told Wesley things about Emmett Holloway that she had not, he suspected, told many people. That he had been a hard man in many ways, demanding and particular, but that he had believed absolutely in her ability to run the ranch, and that belief had been the great gift of her life. That he had taught her the ledgers himself, ridden with her through every pasture, shown her every creek and fence line and water source as though he were passing her something sacred. He did not have a son, she said quietly. Some men would have lamented that. He never seemed to. He said once that any rancher who could not imagine a woman running a ranch had simply never met a woman. Wesley was quiet for a moment, watching the filly trot along the fence line in the golden morning light. Then he said, he was right. She turned and looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. Something careful and guarded gave a fraction of an inch, like a door easing open on a hinge that had not moved in some time. "Not everyone agrees with you," she said. "Not everyone is right," he said. The trouble with Gerald Bower, the disgraced 3rd foreman, was not entirely over. Wesley discovered this in the 5th week of his employment, when he rode into Redemption Creek with Rabbit to collect supplies and encountered 2 men outside the general store who looked at him with the particular unfriendliness of men who had been told to look unfriendly. One of them, a thick-necked man with a jaw like a fence post, stepped partially into Wesley's path and said, "You the new man out at the Holloway place?" "I am the foreman," Wesley said pleasantly. "Word of advice," the man said. "That woman is more trouble than a cattle ranch is worth. Smart men find work elsewhere." Wesley regarded him for a moment with genuine curiosity, the way a man might look at an interesting rock formation. Then he said, "I appreciate the concern," and walked past him into the store. Rabbit, following close behind, whispered, "That is Denton Mace. He works for the Alderman Ranch, which is the biggest operation in the county. Gerald Bower is a cousin of Theodore Alderman." Wesley filed that information carefully. He did not mention the encounter to Violet immediately, but he began paying attention to the edges of the property in a way he had not before, noting which fence lines shared a boundary with the Alderman holdings, watching the cattle counts more carefully, making sure the ledgers were impeccably maintained. He also, without making a production of it, began spending more time with Otis, who had worked the Holloway Ranch for 9 years and had a long memory. "The Alderman Ranch has been wanting the east pasture for years," Otis told him one evening, sitting on the bunkhouse steps as the sun went down in a spectacular blaze of orange and red. "That is what Bower was hired for." "Not to run the ranch, to hand over the land." Wesley looked at him sharply. "You know this for certain." "I suspected it from the day he rode in. He spent too much time at the fence line that borders Alderman's South Range and not enough time with the cattle. Otis pulled at his mustache. Miss Holloway figured it out before most would have. She is sharp that way. She is, Wesley agreed. He thought about it all that night, and in the morning he went to Violet before the first cup of coffee was poured and laid out what he had learned and suspected, clearly and in order. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he had come to appreciate about her. She gave information the full attention it deserved before she responded to it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I knew the land was what they wanted. I did not know Bauer was placed there deliberately. I am not entirely certain of it, but I think you should be aware." She nodded slowly. "What do you recommend?" The fact that she asked him, genuinely, for his recommendation, not in a perfunctory way, not as a formality, but as a real question to which she intended to apply the answer, was something Wesley felt in his chest like a hand pressed warmly against a sore muscle. "I think we document everything meticulously," he said. "Every head of cattle, every fence repair, every water usage, every payment on the land note. I think you get a copy of the original land survey from the county records office, and you keep it somewhere safe. And I think you pay down the note on the east pasture as aggressively as you can this season, because land that is fully paid is land that is harder to take." She looked at him steadily. "You have thought about this." "I have. It is my land, Wesley, my problem. I work for this ranch," he said simply. "Your problems are my problems." There was a pause that had a particular quality to it, something weighted and warm. "All right," she said. "Let us begin." The weeks that followed were among the most demanding, and though Wesley did not fully admit it to himself at the time, the most alive he had felt in years. The spring roundup consumed every hand on the ranch and then some. They hired 2 additional temporary riders to help with the push of the east herd, and Wesley spent long days on Drummer's back covering ground at a pace that left no room for idleness. But what he noticed in the margins of exhaustion was that Violet was out there with him. Not watching from a distance, riding, working. She handled her mare Clementine with the confidence of someone who had grown up in the saddle, and she knew the cattle knew them individually, knew which cows had which calves, knew which sections of pasture hid the hard-to-find strays. She was not pretending to work. She was genuinely working, and she expected to be treated as a working member of the operation, and Wesley treated her accordingly. This created a particular kind of companionship, the kind that forms between people who have survived the same hard days together. By the end of the roundup, 3 weeks after it began, they were riding home side by side in the late evenings with the easy silence of people who no longer need to fill the air between them with words. It was on one of those evenings, with the sky turning from copper to deep purple and the cattle settled and the hands riding ahead, that Violet said, "You have not tried to manage me." He glanced at her. "How do you mean?" "Every foreman before you, even the decent ones. There was always a moment when they began trying to manage me, to redirect my decisions, to suggest I leave certain matters to them, to make me feel that my involvement was a courtesy rather than a right." She paused. "You have not done that. This is your ranch," he said. "It is, but that has not stopped men from forgetting it." He was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to say what he wanted to say. "My father worked for a woman rancher once," he said finally. "In the years after the war, when there were a great many ranches in Texas being run by women whose husbands and fathers had not come back. He said she was the finest cattlewoman he had ever known. He said the men who underestimated her were the ones who lost in the end." Violet was watching him. "Your father sounds like a good man." "He was," Wesley said. "He died 8 years ago, but he gave me most of what I know and all of what I believe about work and people." He paused. "He would have liked this ranch. He would have liked how you run it," she said quietly. They were close enough that their horses walked within a few feet of each other, and the warm evening air carried the smell of cedar and cattle and the distant sweetness of the creek. Wesley was aware of her beside him in a way that went beyond professional awareness, and he suspected she was aware of it too, and he also suspected that neither of them was quite ready to say so aloud. But something had shifted. They both knew it. The night of the spring dance in Redemption Creek came 3 weeks later, in late May of 1882, and Violet announced at breakfast that she intended to go. Wesley raised no objection, though something in his expression apparently communicated a question, because she looked at him over her coffee cup and said, "You are welcome to come, Wesley, if you like dances." "I like them well enough," he said. They rode into town together in the early evening, with Otis and the other hands following behind on their own horses, everyone cleaned up and in their better clothes. Redemption Creek was not a large town, but it had a church with a wide yard, and the spring dance was held there every year with a fiddle player named Harmon and a banjo player named Clay, and a caller who had a voice like a train whistle. The whole county came, or close to it. Wesley had not attended a social gathering of any significance in some time, having spent the winter moving between ranches, and he had forgotten how much he missed the human business of it. The clusters of conversation, the children running through the lantern light, the old men on chairs at the edge of the yard telling stories, the music coming up bright and quick from the far end where the musicians had set up. Violet, beside him, moved through the evening with a particular kind of dignity. People greeted her, some warmly, some cautiously, and she responded to all of them with the same measured courtesy. She was wearing a dress he had not seen before, a dark blue calico that suited her coloring, and her hair was down around her shoulders in a way it was never down at the ranch, and Wesley found it extremely difficult to look anywhere else. He danced with her twice. The first time was at the beginning of the evening, when the caller pulled everyone into a square dance, and it was simply the thing to do, and he took her hand and they moved through the figures with the competence of two people who had both learned these dances as children and had not forgotten them. She was light on her feet and sure of the steps, and she laughed once when he made a small misstep in a complicated turn, and the sound of it went directly through him. The second dance was later, after the fire had burned lower and the fiddle had slowed to something softer, and he asked her and she said yes, and they moved together in a way that was close enough to say something. Her hand in his, her shoulder under his palm, her face near enough that he could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes by the firelight. "People are watching us," she said quietly. "People always watch," he said. "They are wondering." "What are they wondering?" "The same thing I am wondering," she said. He looked at her, she looked back. The music moved around them. "And what is that?" he said, his voice lower than he intended. "Whether this is going to be something," she said very quietly, "or whether you are just a very good foreman." He thought about that. He thought about the evenings on the porch, the ledgers on the table, the ride home with the purple sky, the way she had said his father would have liked this ranch. "I am a very good foreman," he said. "That is not all I am." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she said, "No, I did not think it was." They did not say anything else about it that evening, but on the ride home, she pulled her mare close enough to Drummer that their stirrups occasionally touched, and she told him a story about a dance she had attended with her father years ago, when she was 17, and the story was funny and warm and personal, and Wesley listened to every word as though it were something rare. The situation with Theodore Alderman came to a head in mid-June. Wesley had expected something. The Alderman Ranch's interest in the East pasture was too clear, and Bauer's disgrace too recent for the matter to simply dissolve, but the form it took surprised him somewhat. A writer came to the Holloway Ranch on a Tuesday morning with a letter, formally addressed to Violet Holloway, from the offices of a land attorney in San Antonio. The letter proposed, in careful legal language, a purchase of the East pasture at a price Wesley calculated quickly to be about 60% of market value. It was accompanied by a separate note, written on plain paper in a firm hand, suggesting that the offer was time-sensitive and that the financial pressures of running the ranch alone might make this an attractive resolution. Violet read both documents at the kitchen table with Wesley sitting across from her. When she finished, she put them down, and her jaw was set in a way he had come to recognize as the outer surface of something much hotter. 60 cents on the dollar for land my father spent 20 years improving, she said. And the implication that you are vulnerable, Wesley added. Yes, she looked at him. We are not vulnerable. No, he said, we are not. I want to write a response. I thought you might. I also think you should ride to the county seat yourself and confirm the status of the land note payment we made last month. Get it in writing. She nodded. Come with me. The ride to the county seat, a town called Hartwell, was a day and a half on horseback, and they made it in 2 days, leaving at first light on Wednesday and riding with a steady purpose that did not allow much room for distraction. They talked as they rode about the land, about the legal position, about what Violet's rights were, and how clearly those rights could be documented. And they also talked about other things, because the road was long and the country was beautiful, and two people who have been dancing around something significant will eventually find it easier to simply talk. She told him about her childhood on the ranch, about learning to rope at 8, about her mother teaching her to read from the family Bible, and then from every other book they could obtain, about the loneliness of being the only child on a working ranch far from town, and how she had mostly made her peace with it by filling the silence with work and books. About the young man in town she had once thought she might care for, years ago, who had made it clear that he expected a wife who would leave the ranch to men and confine herself to the house, and about how that had clarified things for her considerably. It was not that I was opposed to love, she said, watching the road ahead. I was opposed to the kind of love that required me to become smaller. Wesley rode beside her in the warm afternoon sun and thought about all the ways people made themselves smaller for the sake of being loved and all the cost that came with it. That is a reasonable thing to oppose, he said. She glanced at him sideways. You are the most reasonable man I have ever encountered in an unreasonable country, Wesley Alden. I take that as a high compliment. It is meant as one. They stayed at a boarding house in Hartwell that night, separate rooms correctly, and the following morning Violet met with the county clerk and confirmed, with documentation, that the note payment had been recorded and that the East Pasture land title was in her name without encumbrance. The clerk, a small, precise man named Henderson, tried twice to address his answers to Wesley rather than to Violet, and both times Wesley said, quite pleasantly, "The ranch belongs to Miss Holloway." I believe she asked you the question. Henderson adjusted his approach. Violet noticed, though she said nothing about it until they were back outside and the door had closed behind them, when she said, "Thank you for that." "A man should answer the person who asked the question," Wesley said. "It is simple courtesy." They rode back to the ranch in good spirits, the paperwork secure in Violet's saddlebag, the summer heat building on the hills around them, and the creek crossings cool and bright. On the second afternoon of the return ride, they stopped to let the horses drink at a wide bend in the creek where the water slowed and turned clear over smooth gray stones. The shade of the cottonwood trees along the bank was thick and welcome, and they sat for a while on the bank, letting the horses rest, and the silence between them was the deep, easy kind. Wesley was watching the water move over the stones, thinking about the way light looked through moving water, which was something that had pleased him since he was a boy, when Violet said, "I have been thinking about what I said at the dance." He looked at her. "About whether this is going to be something," she said. "I remember," he said. "I want to be clear with you, Wesley, about what I am and what this ranch is." She folded her hands in her lap, looking at the creek. "This land is not incidental to me. It is not a dowry or a backdrop or something I intend to set aside. It is my life's work. I will not marry a man who sees it as his property by virtue of marriage. I would never want it to be mine by any mechanism other than your choosing," he said, "and even then it would be yours. Marriage does not erase ownership of the mind." She looked at him sharply. "You say that very easily." "I mean it very seriously." He paused. "I am not interested in your land, Violet. I am interested in you." Her name on his lips without the formality. He had not used it before, not like that, not in that tone, and she heard it, he could tell. "You are very sure of yourself," she said, but there was no edge in it. "No," he said. "I am very sure of what I want. That is different." He turned to face her fully. "I think you know what I am saying." She met his eyes. The creek ran and the cottonwood leaves moved above them and the horses stood quiet in the shallows. "I think I do," she said. He reached out slowly and took her hand where it rested on the bank, and she let him, and they sat that way for a while without speaking, which was its own kind of saying everything. Back at the ranch, July arrived with its full Texas heat and its furious demands. The east herd was sorted, and the culls were cut and driven to the railhead by Wesley and Otis and Pete over the course of a week, a hard drive that left all three of them sunburned and trail-dusted and satisfied. The cattle sold well better than Wesley had projected, and when he rode back and gave Violet the final numbers at the kitchen table that evening, she looked at the figures for a long moment and then looked up at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Relief. Pure, deep relief, the kind that lives underneath years of tension. "It covers the note," she said, "with enough left over to repair the north barn roof before winter," he said. She pressed both hands flat on the table and let out a long breath. "My father would be so relieved," she said softly. Wesley watched her and felt something that he recognized, finally and without any further uncertainty, as love. Not the cautious appreciation he had felt in the early weeks, not the warmth of professional regard, but the full thing, the thing that makes a person want to be present for someone's relief and someone's joy and someone's difficulty, and all the ordinary days between. He reached across the table and covered her hands with his. She looked up, her eyes were bright. "He would be proud of you," Wesley said. "Not relieved, proud." She did not pull her hand away. She turned it over and held his, and they stayed at the kitchen table as the summer evening came in through the open window, warm and fragrant with cedar and wildflowers, and the ranch settled into its nighttime quiet around them. The letter to the land attorney in San Antonio was sent the following week. Violet wrote it herself, in her clear, precise hand, and Wesley read it at her request before she sealed it. It declined the offer in terms that were courteous, unambiguous, and contained enough legal precision to make clear that the writer understood her rights completely. It also noted briefly that all payments on the Holloway Ranch properties were current and fully documented, and that the ranch was not and would not be under financial duress. Theodore Alderman, through an intermediary, sent a second approach, not a letter this time but a personal visit. Alderman himself, riding up the Main, rode one afternoon in a fine buggy with a driver, dressed in the way of a man who considers his clothing to be an argument. He was perhaps 55, heavy-shouldered, with the manner of someone who had gotten what he wanted for so long that asking had become indistinguishable from demanding. He asked to speak to the owner of the Holloway Ranch. Violet met him on the porch. Wesley stayed 2 steps behind her and slightly to the right, not speaking, present. Otis was at the barn, visible. The other hands were working nearby in that particular way of men who have positioned themselves within earshot without making it obvious. Alderman looked at Violet and then at Wesley and then back at Violet. "Miss Holloway," he said, "I wondered if we might speak privately about a business matter." "My foreman has my full confidence," Violet said. "Whatever you have to say can be said in front of him." Alderman's jaw tightened slightly, but he proceeded. He offered the East pasture purchase again, this time at a somewhat higher price, still below true market value, but less insulting, and framed it in terms of neighborly cooperation and the difficulties of managing a large cattle operation alone. Violet listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "Mr. Alderman, the East pasture is not for sale at any price. It was my father's land, and it is my land, and it will be my children's land after me." She paused. "I appreciate you making the drive out here personally. That does show good manners, but my answer is no, and it will remain no." Alderman looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression of a man recalibrating. Then he looked at Wesley. "Alden," he said. "Mr. Alderman," Wesley said, "you are working for a difficult woman. "I am working for a capable one," Wesley said. "I find it suits me." There was a pause that hung in the air like dust after a hard wind. Then Alderman nodded once, got back into his buggy, and was driven away down the main road in a cloud of summer dust. When the buggy was out of sight, Violet turned and looked at Wesley, and he saw that her hands were perfectly steady and her chin was up and her eyes were bright. "You said my children's land," Wesley said quietly. She looked at him. Something warm moved across her face. "I did. Is that something you have thought about?" "Recently?" she said. "Yes." He nodded slowly, feeling the weight and the warmth of that answer settle in him. That evening after dinner they sat on the porch as they had begun to do regularly, their chairs close, the night sky enormous and full of stars, the ranch dark and quiet around them. The summer crickets were loud in the grasses, and somewhere down by the creek a frog was calling. Wesley had been thinking about what he wanted to say for several days, arranging and rearranging it, and he had finally concluded that there was no arrangement that was going to improve on honesty, so he simply said it. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you answer, my work here does not change. I am committed to this ranch regardless." She turned to look at him. Her expression was careful but not guarded. "I have been in love with you," he said, "for longer than I realized while I was in the middle of it. I think it started around the third morning at the kitchen table, when you asked me a question about the cattle ledger that told me you already knew the answer, and you were testing whether I did too." Something very quiet happened in her face, something that looked like recognition. "I love the way you run this ranch," he continued. "I love that you fired a thief and refused a fraudster and would not be bullied by a man in a buggy. I love that you left a novel on my bunkhouse table and that you can sit in silence on a creek bank for 20 minutes and make it feel like a conversation. I love you, Violet, and I would very much like, if you are willing, to spend my life beside you." The night held them both for a moment. She reached over and took his hand from the arm of his chair, holding it in both of hers. She looked out at the dark yard, at the barn, at the faint shapes of the cattle in the near pasture, at the endless stars over all of it. "I have never wanted to love someone who would diminish me," she said quietly. "I was very patient about that, very determined. And then you rode up the main road on that bay horse and asked when you could start, and I thought, well, this is going to be complicated." He turned to look at her. "Was it?" "Terribly," she said, and looked at him and smiled. "I love you, Wesley Alden. I believe I have for quite some time." He stood from his chair, and she stood from hers, and he held both her hands in his, and the night was warm and enormous around them. And he kissed her, there on the porch of the limestone house that her father had built, with the cattle in the pasture and the stars overhead, and the ranch that was entirely hers, and would always be hers, spreading out around them in every direction. She kissed him back with all the decisive intensity of a woman who had waited a long time for something worth wanting. They were engaged by the end of July. Wesley rode into Redemption Creek and came back with a ring, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, because the garnet was dark red and reminded him, he told her, of the color of the wild plum blossoms on the east pasture fence line in spring. She put it on her finger at the kitchen table, looked at it for a moment, and then looked up at him with an expression that was the most open he had ever seen on her face, all of the careful reserve set aside, just Violet, clear-eyed and certain and radiant. "It fits," she said. "I measured your other ring while you were sleeping," he said. She laughed. "You measured, Wesley. You are a thoroughly practical man." "I try to be," he said, grinning. "It is absolutely my favorite thing about you," she said. "Among many." They married in September, just as the summer heat was beginning to ease and the evening air carried the first hint of autumn. The wedding was held at the Redemption Creek Church, small and proper, with Otis standing up for Wesley and a woman from town named Clara Marsh, who had been Violet's closest friend since girlhood, standing up for Violet. Gus Prentice attended in a suit that appeared to be from approximately 1865, and appeared very emotional throughout the ceremony in a way he subsequently denied entirely. The Reverend was a small, earnest man named Aldridge, and when he said the words that bound them together, Wesley looked at Violet and Violet looked at Wesley, and the whole room went very quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when the people at the center of them are completely present and completely certain. They said their vows in steady voices. She did not promise to obey. Nobody mentioned it. After the ceremony, the town celebrated in the churchyard with food and music and dancing, and Wesley and Violet danced every dance, and when Harmon the fiddle player played something slow and sweet near the end of the evening, Wesley held his wife. That was a word that settled on him like good earth, warm and solid, and they moved slowly in the lantern light while the stars came out above Redemption Creek. "Happy?" he asked. "Profoundly," she said, against his shoulder. "You?" "Beyond my ability to describe it accurately," he said. "I will try to demonstrate it over time." She laughed, and he felt it in his chest against his heart. The autumn brought with it the north barn roof repair, which Wesley and the hands completed over the course of 2 weeks in the cooling October air, and the winter preparations, the hay stores, the cattle shelter arrangements, the inventory of supplies that needed to be laid in before the cold settled in properly. Violet ran the ledgers with her usual precision, and Wesley ran the operations with his, and the ranch moved through the end of the year in good order. They were working together, which was what they had always done and would keep doing, which was what they both wanted. Winter on the Holloway Ranch, which was now also recorded in the county books as the Holloway Alden Ranch, at Violet's insistence, over Wesley's mild objection that it was her father's name and should remain primary, which she overruled by pointing out that it was also her name, and she intended to combine them, and that was final, was cold and demanding in the particular way of Texas winters, which were less about sustained freezing and more about unpredictable swings between warmth and bitter cold that kept a rancher permanently watchful. They spent a great deal of time indoors together in those months, and Wesley discovered that Violet Holloway was, in the confined intimacy of shared domestic life, even more interesting than she had been at a professional distance. She had opinions about everything: literature, land management, the proper way to make cornbread, the character of clouds before a storm, and she expressed them with a directness that he loved absolutely. She was warm in ways that surprised him, having initially presented as so contained. She brought him his coffee before he was fully awake in the mornings. She mended a tear in his work coat without comment and left it folded on the table. She sometimes sang quietly to herself while she worked at the stove, old hymns and folk songs in a low, unself-conscious voice that he took great care not to interrupt. He brought her books from the Redemption Creek lending library when he went for supplies. He fixed things on the ranch that were annoying but not urgent, because he noticed what was annoying her before she mentioned it. He listened to her, really listened, with his full attention, the way his father had taught him to listen to land and livestock, which was to say with his whole self. They argued sometimes, in the way of two people who both have strong opinions and mutual respect, never cruelly, always productively, always coming back to the same fundamental agreement that they were on the same side. By the time the early plum blossoms came back to the east pasture fence line in February of 1883, Violet told him over the kitchen table breakfast that she was expecting their first child. Wesley put his coffee cup down. He looked at her. She was watching him with the same careful, assessing look she had given him the morning he rode up to the ranch on Drummer asking for work, and he understood that she was watching for his response the way she always watched for what it would tell her about who he truly was. What he did was stand up from his chair, come around the table, take her face in both his hands, and say, "Violet, that is the most magnificent news I have received in my entire life." She exhaled. Her eyes were very bright. "I thought you might be pleased." "Pleased does not begin to cover it," he said. "Are you well? How do you feel? What do you need?" "I feel fine," she said. "I need you to stop looking at me like I might shatter. I'm not a delicate creature, Wesley." "I know that," he said, sitting in the chair beside her rather than across the table and taking her hand. I'm looking at you like that because you are about to do something extraordinary, not because I think you are fragile. You are the least fragile person I have ever met." She squeezed his hand. "Good, because the spring roundup is coming and I intend to ride through the first trimester at minimum." "On Clementine," he said. "Not Biscuit." She looked at him. "Clementine is the steadiest horse on this ranch." "Agreed." That was not an argument, it was a preference. She looked at him a moment longer and then nodded. "Clementine. Yes, that is sensible." The spring of 1883 unfolded in the full richness of a year that knows what it is. Violet rode the pastures on Clementine through the roundup with Wesley beside her on Drummer, and the ranch hands, who were aware by then of the situation, were quietly protective of her without making it obvious, which was the right way to handle it, and they all knew it. Rabbit, who had somehow developed into an excellent ranch hand over the past year, took on additional tasks without being asked, which earned him a raise that Wesley authorized and Violet approved. Otis presented Wesley with a carved wooden rattle one afternoon in May, leaving it on the bunkhouse table without a word, which was the most he would acknowledge the emotional weight of the occasion. Wesley thanked him by name the following morning, which caused Otis to look intensely at the middle distance for a moment before going back to work. The summer was warm and productive and the cattle prices held well, and the Holloway Alden ranch made its payments and completed its improvements, and the east pasture remained exactly what it had always been: Holloway land, paid in full, belonging to Violet and to the future she was building in it. Theodore Alderman made no further approaches. The word around the county was that he had found his attention drawn elsewhere, and Wesley suspected, though he never confirmed it, that the clear legal documentation of the East Pasture title, combined with the marriage and the evident stability of the ranch's operations, had made the proposition simply not worth pursuing. Some problems, properly addressed, simply stopped. The baby came in October of 1883, a boy, strong-lunged and full-headed with dark hair that came from his mother, and a set expression that came from both of them. They named him Emmett Wesley Alden, and when Violet held him the first time in the bedroom of the limestone house, in the warm light of the lamp, Wesley sat beside them and felt the whole axis of his world shift permanently and gloriously. "Hello, Emmett," Violet said softly to the baby, who blinked at her with the ancient, serious expression of the very newly arrived. "This ranch is going to be yours one day, if you want it. Though you are welcome to be a schoolteacher or a lawyer or whatever else occurs to you. He has your eyes," Wesley said. "He has your chin," she said. "Poor creature. There is nothing wrong with my chin." "I was being affectionate," she said, looking up at him with complete warmth. He reached over and tucked the blanket more securely around the baby and then around Violet's arm, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the three of them remained that way for a while as the October night settled around the ranch house, deep and quiet and full of stars. Otis, informed the following morning, looked at the baby for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "He looks like a rancher." Which was, from Otis, an extraordinary endorsement. The years that followed had the quality of good work done well, not without difficulty, because ranching in that era was never without difficulty, and the droughts of the 1880s would test even the best prepared operations. There were hard summers and harder winters and seasons when the cattle market was poor, and the land needed more than it gave back. But the Holloway Alden Ranch had been built on solid foundations, sound finances, good land management, and the particular strength of two people who were genuinely capable of running a ranch and genuinely in love with each other, which turned out to be an extraordinarily effective combination. Young Emmett grew into a serious, curious child who followed his mother through the pastures and his father through the barn with equal devotion, and who could identify 12 different grasses by the time he was 5, which both his parents found excellent. In 1886, he was joined by a sister, whom they named Ruth after Wesley's mother, and Ruth arrived with a personality that was immediately and completely her, own joyful and loud, and endlessly in motion, the perfect counterweight to her brother's thoughtful gravity. By the spring of 1887, the year that Ruth learned to walk, and immediately attempted to investigate the chickens with consequences for everyone involved, the Holloway Alden Ranch was among the more prosperous mid-sized operations in the county. The east pasture was fully developed. The cattle herd was healthy and well managed. The north barn had been expanded, and Biscuit the sorrel filly had become a fine working mare who was being considered for the broodmare band. Rabbit, who had been with the ranch since the beginning, had grown into a capable man of 30, and had recently asked Wesley's opinion on a young woman from town he was thinking about courting. Wesley had given him the opinion he asked for, which was that the right woman was worth every awkward conversation and every uncertain moment. And 2 months later, Rabbit married the woman in question, who turned out to be a schoolteacher named Josephine with strong opinions about education and a warm, direct manner that Violet immediately liked. Otis retired from the heavy work of ranching in the autumn of 1887, his body finally requiring what his stubbornness had been refusing for some years. He settled into a smaller role on the ranch mending tack, keeping the smaller pens, advising when advice was welcome, and Wesley built him a small, comfortable addition onto the bunkhouse that was his alone, because Otis had no family elsewhere and the ranch was where he belonged. On a November evening in 1887, with the ranch settled for the year and the children asleep and the fire burning low in the limestone fireplace, Wesley sat on the porch with Violet as they had sat on the porch on uncountable evenings, close together in the cool autumn air, the stars overhead, the ranch around them. He was 34. She was 31. They had been married 5 years, had built 5 years of days together, had weathered the droughts and the market swings and the ordinary extraordinary difficulty of making something alive out of land and labor and love. "Do you remember," Violet said, looking out at the dark yard, "what Gus Prentice told you about me before you came to the ranch?" Wesley smiled. "That you had run off 3 foremen. And you asked when you could start," she said. "I did." She looked at him, and in the lantern light from the window behind them, her face was as familiar and as moving to him as anything in the world. "What made you do that, truly, when any sensible man would have gone elsewhere?" He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything she asked him. "The men you ran off," he said. "The way Gus described it, a thief, a man who did not respect your knowledge, and a fraudster. Running off those 3 men was not a character flaw, it was evidence of character." He paused. "And I suppose I was curious about the woman who had done it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Only curious. Curious first," he said. "Then considerably more than that." She reached over and took his hand, the garnet ring on her finger catching the lantern light, and she leaned her head against his shoulder the way she had the night Emmett was born, and he felt as he had felt on that night and on countless nights before and after, the deep, settled, enormous happiness of having found exactly where he belonged. "I am glad you asked," she said quietly. "So am I," he said. "Every day I am glad." They sat together as the night deepened over the Holloway Alden Ranch, the land stretching out around them in all directions under the stars, the cattle quiet in the pastures, the children sleeping in the house behind them, and everything they had built together present and alive and real in the November dark. The east pasture was still there, paid and documented and undivided. The north barn was solid. The ledgers were clean. Emmett would ride the fence lines one day, if he chose to, and Ruth would make her own choices about what she wanted to build in this world, and Violet Alden, who would always be Violet Holloway as well, because a name is not erased but added to, would see to it that they had every advantage and every freedom that she and Wesley could provide. And Wesley Alden, who had ridden up a limestone ranch, rode one spring morning on a steady bay horse with everything he owned and nothing to lose, had found, as the best things are found, not what he was looking for but something far better than he had known to look for. He had found her. And she, who had waited with great patience and great certainty for someone who would stand beside her rather than in front of her, who would call her capable rather than difficult, who would stay, she had found him too. The ranch was quiet. The stars were extraordinary. Inside the house, Emmett was sleeping with his hands curled under his chin in the way of small children, and Ruth had one arm thrown over the side of her small bed in a gesture that was already entirely her, and the fire in the limestone fireplace burned to comfortable coals. On the porch, Violet Holloway and Wesley Alden sat together in the good darkness, holding hands, watching over everything they loved. It was exactly enough. It was, in every way that mattered, everything.